learning ecosystems are not wholly organic. They require orchestration. They require a lot of inputs of energy and labor. And one of the great lessons of open systems in the last 5 or 10 years, of crowdsourcing, open innovation of all kinds, is they work best when they are both very open, but also very directed, very guided. And there's a hybrid quality to the ones which work, which is quite different from the sort of cliches about the wisdom of crowds and so on. And this is perhaps the craft knowledge of learning ecosystems, which we're all trying to learn.
For me, an innovative learning ecosystem is an ecosystem of learning where every learner's learning is a contribution, not only to himself, but to the community. And so everyone in the community can learn more easily. And even better, the whole community is improving the way the next generation is going to learn. Okay? Every new learner. So the tools for learning are improving constantly, not just the content.
It actually touches on something, Jeff, you mentioned as well as Gwang-Jo, this notion that learning ecosystems need to be organized, that they aren't necessarily self-organizing entities. So I'd like to pose to the panel the question of who organizes learning ecosystems for students? And what is the role, for example, of government in somehow being a part of the creation or sustaining of learning ecosystems?
You talk about students, so immediately everyone thinks about the school as being the place where you bring learning together, and I do think that is the case. I think teachers do have a new role to play. We hear, sage on the stage, guide on the side, mentor in the centre, facilitator. We have all these metaphors for what a teacher is, and I think today the metaphor is curator. Curator of the learning environment. If you think about the museum, where the museum curator will put out selected artifacts with a little bit of information about them in some logical progression to help the students make sense of what's there. And it's then up to the learner to develop and find out more, like your mother going out and finding more. Something grabs your attention, grabs your interest, and you develop your learning through the things that grab your interest. You go to the archives. The internet is the archives. You go elsewhere, you go and talk to people, you find communities. But what the teacher has done is curating that and helping the learners to make sense of all the information, the myriad of information that's out there. And, we have so much stuff. And how does any learner make sense? And we do need more knowledgeable others to support the learners. And of course, other learners working with them. But that curation idea, I think, is something we need to grasp and think about.
I think governments have a hard time following technologies and following students. So it's hard for them to predict what students would be doing and what technology will be doing. But what I think they can do is contribute to create a frame where students would be invited to think about these issues. And for instance, if a government decides to fund a PhD program that is dedicated to building tools for improving the technologies of learning, that will be a big progress. Okay? If you look at most technology we're using today, even in a learning environment, have not been designed for learning. Okay? Most of them have been designed for many other reasons, and they end up being sold as well to schools or learners, okay, and their parents. And making a real effort of developing technologies of learning, I will call them Socratic technologies, okay, which is emphasizing the Socratic method, the critical thinking, the questioning, the ability to collaborate and to creatively, collectively produce knowledge for oneself and for the collective.
Well, I certainly, having worked a lot in governments, wouldn't encourage governments to lead on running learning ecosystems. And one very striking point, when we were developing studio schools, we drew on examples from all over the world, from Paraguay, Brazil, India, but nearly always they were examples quite away from the gaze of government, where in a way they'd mobilized the whole community as teachers, learners, etc., without much involvement of the state. I think there are things governments can do, mainly not getting in the way through their assessment rules, their funding rules, their regulatory rules. Most controversially, I would say that for any school system to be able to do the things my fellow panelists have talked about, you have to make it possible to create brand new schools with a radically different ethos. And the fact that in many public systems it is almost impossible to create a new school with a different ethos guarantees these ideas don't come to fruition. And that is, I say, a controversial point.
Perhaps I have to disagree with some of fellow
Please do.
panelists when we think about the role of government. It may be true in some societies or some countries, but in other societies, we still expect government to play a major role, if not the leading role. I say this because, number one, many schools will be irrelevant. You may think irrelevant, but you will recognize, compared to 20 years back, we still have schools in all countries in the world. Regardless of development, that's one thing, which means there is something that schools still deliver. And still, I would say, if we believe that schools are still important, I think the government has to play some role to make schools to become a more desirable learning ecosystem. I say this because based on our experience in Asia Pacific, some of the high-performing countries, I talked about Singaporean case, but they are not without any challenges. For instance, when it comes to learning, it's all about learning to perform well in tests, if I exaggerate a little bit. I would say some of these systems are very much driven by exam, and that's high-stake exams to get access to prestigious institutions, which will guarantee a better or decent job or lucrative profession later on. And of course, the government alone cannot change this whole incentive schemes. So what I would argue for the government is one thing that government can do is perhaps they can change the rule of game, and also the government can support the remote villages and communities where, as I said, where they don't have this luxurious technology. So the government can provide funding and support. And last but not least, when it comes to education and learning and teachers, the government, there's a great room for the government to do more about the teachers. Typically, teachers are not very well paid in many countries, unfortunately. But if you look at high-performing countries, teachers in Finland, for instance, in Singapore, in my country, Korea, Japan, they are very well paid and respected. And these are some of the things that the government can do.
One of the important things government can do to free the technology evolution on one side and make it available to everyone, including in the most remote communities, is make sure this is developed in an open source model where the content is under Creative Commons license and so on. And that's true, I think, of any local government. It's even more true at the larger scale. So, it's more true at the European scale and at the French scale, and it's even more true at the world scale. Okay? So I think, there is a very important message that governments should hear on this issue, and that's the only way we can reap the world benefits. And furthermore, what has been proven scientifically, and I can again discuss this if you want, there is experiment that show that an open source of collaboration is much more creative and much more reactive and much more efficient, and ends up providing much better result in the long run. So we need to incentivize this. It doesn't say there shouldn't be company involved. It doesn't say anything like this. Google and many others are using open source technologies, IBM and so on. Okay, so we can think of the right models, and that's where governments can think about the legal framework and the economic framework.
How do we actually achieve collective intelligence for the individual, the organization, the nation? I think overall our systems of orchestration of knowledge are incredibly poor globally, so there is very little learning and therefore people repeat lots of unnecessary mistakes. If you think of collective intelligence though as a hierarchy, at the bottom is data, information, knowledge, judgment, wisdom. We have very powerful tools at the bottom for data, but almost no advance at all in judgment, let alone wisdom. And in a way, the risk of the internet era is that it is so strong on data, it may even weaken our powers of judgment and wisdom. I happen not to believe that nations face inevitable declining trajectories, and all over the world, including this region, China, India, we have many examples of nations turning themselves around. But that's a complex topic which cannot be understood just through data analytics. It requires very different modes of collective intelligence. And for me, the great challenge for the organizations you've worked in, like OECD, is how can they really leap ahead in terms of their ability to orchestrate all of these different levels of intelligence and make it useful.